Hello everyone, I am honored to introduce our final guest speaker for a closing note here at the Human Advantage Conference. As usual, my friend and colleague Ted Utoft is with me for this important conversation with our guest. Hi again,
Hi.
Ted. Olivier Sibony is a professor, author, and advisor specializing in the quality of strategic thinking and the design of decision processes. Olivier is professor of strategy at HEC Paris. He is also an associate fellow at Saïd Business School at Oxford University and has taught at the London Business School, École Polytechnique, ENA, IE Madrid, and other institutions. Previously, Olivier spent 25 years with McKinsey Company in France and in the US, where he was a senior partner. Olivier's latest book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, co-authored with Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein, has appeared on multiple bestseller lists worldwide, including the New York Times. His previous book, You Are About to Make a Terrible Mistake, was awarded in 2019 Manpower Foundation Grand Prize for Best Managing Book of the Year and has been translated into multiple languages. He is also the co-author of Cracked It, How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions like Top Strategy Consultant. In addition, Olivier is the author and co-author of numerous scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals and in practitioner-oriented publications such as the Harvard Business Review, McKinsey Quarterly, MIT Sloan Management Review, California Management Review, and more. So Olivier builds on his research and experience to advise senior leaders on strategic and operational decision making. So a lot to learn from Olivier. Welcome, Olivier, and thank you for being with us today. We are more than excited to have you here for this closing note at the Human Advantage Conference.
Thank you very much, Eric. The pleasure is mine, and it's a great honor.
Great to have you here, Olivier. After what's been a very busy but truly kind of rich series of conversations here at the Human Advantage, in this final conversation, after 2 days during which we've explored the power of behavioral science through real-life case studies, discussions with academics, with top practitioners in lots of different domains, we'd like to discuss with you about the role of leaders and especially how to help them make the best possible decisions for their organization and employees based on behavioral science learnings. Because Olivier, you mentioned in your writing that even great leaders and managers of the best organizations make mistakes. Can you explain this, and do you have any kind of examples in mind?
Well, if I could explain it, we wouldn't need this conference. But as Eric pointed out, my background before turning to academia is as a management consultant. And when you're a management consultant in a strategy consulting firm, you are in a unique position. You have a unique vantage point from which to observe how decisions are really made. And when I say made, I mean the actual making of the decision, as in the making of the sausage. And the old joke about sausages applies to strategic decisions as well. They may be good in the end, but you don't really want to see how they're made. The process is not that pretty. And when you are a consultant, you see the actual making of the sausage. And one of my big surprises I remember as a very junior consultant was that sometimes the process of making those decisions, which was supposed to be rational and disciplined and organized, and even in some of the best organizations and with some of the best leaders who were our clients at the time, was actually very messy. And I've always wondered how it could be so messy until I stumbled upon the topic of this conference, behavioral science. And I realized that part of the explanation for how messy those decision processes could be and how sometimes bad the resulting decisions might be, the answer might actually lie in behavioral science, or at least it might be part of the answer. So That's how I came to behavioral science. My initial surprise and my focus since then has been on trying to understand how decisions are actually made in organizations, strategic decisions especially, but not exclusively, how they can be made better, and how to change the behavior of leaders from the way they decide today to the way management science tells us they should be deciding.
Great. So we could start speaking about the kind of role of biases. And what are the biases that you consider the most, let's say, dangerous or risky for a leader when they're making strategic decisions?
That's a question I get a lot, and I tend to resist answering it with a straight answer, as you might suspect. I tend to think that what actually matters in strategic decisions are patterns of biases or combinations of biases that create a pattern of decision making that tends to go wrong. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of evidence, and we've had a lot of evidence for a long time, that when big companies plan an acquisition, they will overestimate the synergies, and they will overestimate how easy it will be to capture those synergies. They will underestimate the challenges. Sometimes people say they underestimate the cultural challenges, but that's just a way of saying they underestimate what they don't know. And basically, they will be too optimistic and they will tend to overpay. We've got a lot of evidence that acquisitions, on average, tend not to create value for the acquirers. Now, is that because of one bias? Is that because of, say, overconfidence? Well, that's certainly part of it, but there is a lot more to it. There is certainly some groupthink in the team that is planning the acquisition. There, at least that's what I've observed. There is probably status quo bias once you have started in the process of looking at the acquisition and you are committed, you escalate your commitment. So there's that too. There is undoubtedly overconfidence in the planning of the synergies and some of the planning fallacy. There may also be other aspects, other types of biases that are coming into play, including some motivated thinking, if you want to call it that way, because of the conflicts of interest that are present in those kinds of situations. So what we see as one strategic mistake, which is overpaying for an acquisition or a general tendency, a pattern of overpaying for acquisitions, what we see as one strategic mistake does not actually match to one bias. This is not an experimental setting where you can keep all things constant and say there is one mistake, one predictable mistake that we make because of one bias. This is a real life situation in which a lot of biases are at play. And in this particular type of decision, the net balance of those biases tends to be in the direction of a predictable error, which is that you're going to tend to overpay for acquisitions, not underpay, not miss the opportunities. You're going to tend to do too much and overpay. So it's not one bias that I worry about. It's one pattern of decision making, what pattern of bad decision making that is the product of a combination of biases. And I've identified a number of patterns like that, or actually management literature has identified a number of patterns like that, which are difficult to explain if you assume that people are rational and learn from their mistakes, because they shouldn't be making the same mistakes in a recurring way, if that were the case, but which become explainable if you attribute them to combinations of biases. Not one bias, a combination. That's why I resist answering your question in a straight way.
You just mentioned, Olivier, that some of those biases or some of those traps that decision makers can fall into are kind of maybe individual, but others might be more likely to happen when groups are making decisions, by a board or by a management team. So, despite the fact that there are a lot of very smart, very experienced, very capable people around a table, can you tell us a little bit more about what can happen when decisions are made by groups, and what are some things that we should watch out for?
This is really interesting because it's a subject that, in theory, is really well known, is really well researched, is well documented. We know that when you put people in a group, you're going to have a tendency to groupthink, to convergence on a single point of view, which may be wrong. We know that that comes from a number of social influences. We know that hierarchical influences are going to make things worse. We know that there's going to be not only groupthink, but cascade effects, which may lead to a form of polarization of the group. So this has been really well researched by a lot of people. We also know that there are some fairly simple remedies that you can put in place. Something as simple as a recommendation Danny Kahneman has been making for years, which is when you are in a meeting, before you start talking, ask people to write down what they think first. Right? So this is a very simple, it's not obviously the solution, but it's a very simple example of the sort of very practical things you can do if you want to combat groupthink. What strikes me, what I find really interesting, is that organizations do not do it. They just don't. They know they should, at least many of them know they should. When you give them a talk like this and you look at them in the audience and they nod and they say, "Oh yeah, of course we should do that. It's such a simple idea. We should do it." And then they go back to the office, they go to their next meeting and they don't do it. Why don't they do it? Right? That is the really intriguing question, because it's not costly, it's not difficult, it doesn't take time, it takes a minute. Right? So why don't they do it? I think the simple answer is because, and that goes back to your initial question about leadership, because most leaders do not really want to get the best answer. They do not. They do not really want to get the best answer. They want to get a consensus and move forward. They want to get agreement in the group, and to do that, they want to suppress dissent. I mean, suppress is a bit strong, but they want to lead people to converge as quickly as possible on what seems a generally acceptable idea, which in general is their idea. So they are going to signal or telegraph subtly, or maybe not too subtly, what they think, so that people will tend to align with the boss, and we're going to go around the table and everybody is going to have a chance to chime in and say how much they agree with the idea that the boss has subtly or not so subtly suggested, and we're going to all be in agreement and move forward. Now, intellectually, it's obvious that this is the wrong way to get to the best decision. If you want to get to the best decision, you need to make sure that people who have a doubt, who have a different opinion, who have even the same opinion as you, but for different reasons, express those doubts, express those reasons, and that you get all the facts on the table, because otherwise, a lot of the information that is actually in the heads of people who are in the room does not get out. And you can't be making the best possible decision based on the collective intelligence of the people around you, which people always say, "Oh, I want to get the best of the people on my team." Yeah, but if they don't speak up, you can't get the best of what they have in their heads. It's obvious that you should do that, but you don't, because you really care more about consensus than you care about getting to the correct answer. I think that's a mindset that leaders need to challenge.
And of course, behavioral science isn't just about biases. Leaders are also confronted with what you call in your more recent best-selling book, noise. Can you explain what noise is and how it can contribute to decisions, good or bad, I guess?
So the initial idea behind noise and the reason we use the word noise goes back to the distinction that people make in statistics between bias and noise. If you have a measurement that you're making, if you're using a measuring instrument, for instance, if you are stepping on your bathroom scale in the morning to figure out how much you weigh, you may have an average error, which is a bias. So say, on average, your bathroom scale tells you that you're 1 pound lighter than you actually are. This would be good news, but that's a bias, that's an average error. But there's also variability. There's also random noise around that average. If you step twice on your bathroom scale, you're not going to get exactly the same reading, unless it's a very precise bathroom scale, but that's unusual. So the error comes in two flavors, in two forms. One is the average predictable error, the bias, and the other is the random error, the noise. When we speak of biases, we're talking about predictable errors, we're talking about directional errors, we're talking about explainable errors, we're talking about average error. So in the example I was giving you, people have a tendency when they're estimating synergies in acquisition to overestimate the synergies, to be over-optimistic. That's an average error, a directional error. But if you take two people who are looking at the same deal and you ask them to evaluate the synergies, they're not going to give you exactly the same answer. Since they are making a forecast and there is a correct answer, one of them must be wrong. That is a simple example, but it actually gets much more troubling when you get at expert judgments in a lot of situations where we would expect consistency. For instance, the judgments of judicial judges or the judgment of doctors. If you go to two doctors and they give you two completely different diagnoses, you have a problem. You don't say this is great, it's diversity, it's creativity, it's innovation. No, you say there is a correct answer here, and one of these two doctors, maybe both, must be wrong. So when you have random errors or unexplained errors like this is noise. Now, the point of the book that we wrote with Danny and Cass, Noise, is not that there is variability in human judgment. Of course, there is variability in human judgment, and as soon as you call something a matter of judgment, you accept that there is going to be variability. That's the meaning of saying something is a matter of judgment. If I ask you how much is 6 times 7, it's not a matter of judgment. We expect everybody to agree precisely. But if we say, what's the probability that it's going to rain tomorrow, we accept that you and I can have a different judgment because it's a matter of judgment. The surprise is not that there is variability, it's that there is way more than people expect. And we've been looking at situation after situation in medicine, in justice, which I mentioned, but also in a lot of business fields, in insurance, in HR, in recruiting, in performance evaluations. In field after field after field, we find that there is a lot more random variability than people think, and that it's actually a big problem that has been overlooked. And so we wanted to draw attention to that problem because average errors, also known as biases, of course matter. You don't want to have an average error, but if you have no error on average, that doesn't mean you're right every time. If your doctor diagnoses the correct number of diseases, but he misses your disease and he misdiagnoses someone who is not sick as being sick, on average, he's not making a mistake, but he's making two very important mistakes. So you don't just want not to have biases. Of course, you want to combat biases, but you also want to combat noise. And that's what we talk about in this book.
I think it's clear that making a good decision for a leader is very challenging, not only because of competition, uncertainty of the environment, and the kind of constant change required to adapt the organization to, constantly evolving tech, or because of, just who we are as humans, that in fact, we are part of the challenge in making good decisions. So let's speak about some of the potential solutions that you suggest. Regarding some of those biases that you mentioned, could you share some of your recommendations to help leaders make better decisions, or at least not to make those terrible mistakes?
You mentioned the uncertainty in the environment and the technological change, and a lot of leaders I meet tell me that in those circumstances, it's very important to be one type of leader, to be one style of leader. And that's the archetype of, or I should say the stereotype, of the decisive, risk-taking, take no prisoners, original contrarian leader. Everybody wants to be, it used to be Steve Jobs, but now it tends to be Elon Musk. Someone who doesn't hesitate, who is decisive, who is, one phrase that I hear all the time is, you tell me that I should think, but sometimes any decision is better than no decision. Now step back for a second. That's crazy. I mean, of course, there may be situations where any decision is better than no decision, but right now, where you're sitting, I can think of 20 decisions you could make that would be much worse than making no decision at all. So it's crazy to say that any decision is better than no decision. It's not quite as crazy, but it's short-sighted, at least, to celebrate the people who took big risks and who won. It's a case of the survivor bias. Of course, if we look at the people who were successful, we're going to find some people who took big risks and who were successful. But if we don't look at all the people who took the same risks, we tend to conclude that the successful leaders are the risk takers. So my overall advice, my general advice to leaders is try to forget about those types of role models. Try to think of yourself as a different kind of leader, as not this stereotype of the risk-taking, decisive, unhesitating leader who knows no doubt. That's not who you want to be. You want to be someone who, first, of course, has a healthy appetite for risk, but knows what risks they are taking. You don't want to pretend that you're taking no risks when you're taking risks. You don't want to take crazy risks either. You want to have a rational approach to risk, which is the approach that people who manage the financial portfolio try to have. When it's about finance, we have metrics for risk. When it's not about finance, we don't have such good metrics. So we tend to treat risk as something that should be either eliminated or adopted wholesale. That's not the point. The point is there are some risks we should take. We should know what risk we're taking. We should make sure that they're worth the risk. We should have a healthy, rational attitude to risk. Second, you want to put in place a decision-making process that actually will help you overcome your limits as a decision maker. If you realize that you are a human being, that you're fallible, that you have biases, and that you have also variability and noise in your judgment, you're going to want to put in place a process, a method that constrains your decision making a little bit. And that means that there is going to be instances where the process you designed, the clock you built, gives you a different time from the time you think it is. Where your gut feeling is going to say, yeah, the process says I should do this, but I really feel I should do that. And that's where, if you are a sensible, rational decision maker, you should be willing to challenge yourself and to say, look, if the people I've hired and I trust and the process I've designed tells me that I should not be making this acquisition, despite the urge I feel to make this acquisition because I feel myself compelled to win the battle and to be the one who makes it to the cover of the magazines as the winner of the big auction, basically, I should resist and I should follow the process. I should be a disciplined decision maker. And as part of that, what this boils down to is you're going to want to have a healthy degree of humility relative to the rest of your team. If you want people to agree with you, at some point you should ask yourself, why is it that you don't agree with them? If you really have a number of people around you that you trust, you should recognize that it's probable that if most of them, I'm not saying that you should always follow the majority, but if most of them think strongly that something is right, it's probably right, even though you think it's wrong, and vice versa. Now, there are exceptions to everything, but you should give a much higher weight than most leaders give to a disciplined process and to a form of collegiality in your decision making, because these two things are the two things that are going to help you overcome your own limitations and your own biases. So, to summarize, healthy, rational attitude to risk, as opposed to a celebration of unfettered risk-taking, discipline in the process, as opposed to trusting your gut feeling and pounding the table, and trusting your team, because it's a team you've handpicked and selected and you think they're good, as opposed to trusting your own judgment as being inherently superior. If you do the three things, which of course require a lot of humility, you will, on average, make better decisions.
And regarding noise in the organization, you mentioned kind of two central ideas, which are a noise audit to better understand the situation, and decision hygiene. Can you elaborate on each of these possible solutions a bit and tell us what could a leader do to reduce those forms of noise?
So a noise audit, first, is not a solution. It's a measurement of the problem. It's a measurement of how much noise there is in your organization. If you don't measure noise, you may ignore noise for a long time. In fact, you probably have ignored noise until now. Most people we speak with about noise say, oh, that's really interesting. I had never thought about that. And the reason you don't think about it is that when you have different people in your organization making different judgments, you don't usually ask two different people to make the same judgments. If you have, say, two underwriters in an insurance company, and they are dealing with separate requests, with separate clients who are asking them for a quote for an insurance policy, you don't normally give the same request to two different underwriters in order to measure how much they disagree. You just assume that there wouldn't be much of a difference between them. That assumption, it turns out, in the insurance company is wrong. It takes a noise audit, an experiment in which you give the same requests to different underwriters to find out how large, and in this case, really, really large, the differences are. Now, once you do the noise audit, you may find, like that insurance company, that the problem is very large and needs to be fixed and is worth fixing because it's a costly problem. You may also find, by the way, that the problem is not so large or not so costly. If you did a noise audit of my grading of my students in HEC Paris, you would find that I'm very noisy, that on some days I'm in a good mood and other days I'm in not such a good mood. And you would find that if you gave the same essays to different professors, they would certainly give different grades. Is that a problem that is worth a lot of money to fix? Probably not, right? Because my decisions do not make a big difference in the big scheme of things. If we were talking about the entrance exam, that would be a different question. But we're talking about essays for people, at the end of an elective. Maybe they'll get an A, maybe they'll get a B. It's not such a big deal. So it's noisy, but it's probably not worth a lot of money to fix. What you want to find out with a noise audit is how much noise there is in your important decisions and how costly that noise is. If it turns out that the noise is costly enough that you want to fix it, that it's worth fixing, that's where you will turn to what we call decision hygiene, which is not one technique, but a set of techniques, a set of practices that provably reduce variability in your judgments. It's a long list, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. One very simple example, which you could apply to my example of grading, is take multiple independent judgments and average them. If you took two professors and you took the average of the grades, you would get a closer to correct estimate of the value of each essay. If you are hiring people in your organization, you intuitively know, and most organizations already put in practice the idea that having several interviewers, several people who give their point of view on a candidate, is better than having just one. Here's the thing that most organizations don't do when they do this. It's to make sure that the judgments are truly independent of each other, and that you actually take the average of multiple independent judgments. That means in practice, if we're talking about hiring decisions, if we're talking about hiring decisions, you want to make sure that multiple people are interviewing the same candidates, but also that they have no idea what others are thinking when they are doing their interview. So you don't want them to communicate. You don't even want something as simple as, hey, Ted, here's a candidate. Why don't you also meet him to see what you think? As opposed to, hey, Ted, here's a really interesting candidate. Why don't you meet him to see what you think? Because I've already influenced you when I'm giving you one of these two transitions. So you want to make sure, if you are really trying to have multiple judgments, you want to make sure that those judgments are independent. And that actually takes work. That takes, again, process. That takes changing the process. So aggregating multiple judgments is one of the components of decision hygiene. There are many more. The general idea of decision hygiene is put the decision-making process under control. Introduce discipline, introduce a form of hygiene. That's why we call it decision hygiene. In the way the decisions are made, define the way they will be made in advance of making them, and then stick to it, because that will put the process under control, that will reduce the variability of the decisions, that will reduce noise, and it probably also will reduce bias, but that's another story.
Maybe one last question for me before I pass back to Eric. What would your advice be for a CEO or a leader of an organization who would like to start applying behavioral science? You know, as you said, it takes a lot of process, it takes a lot of discipline, but if they wanted to kind of do one initial move to start making better decisions at their organization, what would be your kind of first piece of advice for someone who's getting curious about applying behavioral science for their decisions?
So behavioral science is a vast field, right? And you've been talking in this conference about many different applications. So my first piece of advice would be, don't ask yourself how to use behavioral science. Ask yourself what problems you have that need to be fixed. And then whether behavioral science can be a solution to that. Behavioral science is not a panacea, and it only is valuable to the extent that it solves a problem you have, or that it helps capture an opportunity that is relevant to you. If you apply this to the field of decision-making processes, which is my particular niche in the field of behavioral science, what that means is pick one decision process, one type of decisions, one class of decisions that your organization is making on a fairly repeated basis, because that's easier. So a type of routine that you have, a decision routine, that matters to you and that makes a difference to the performance of your business, and ask yourself how to improve it. What could that be? Well, it depends. If you're a pharma company, it's probably your R&D process, the process by which you decide to move the compound from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, etc. If you're an investment firm, it's probably your investment committee. If you're a consulting firm, it's probably your hiring process and your evaluation process. It's fairly simple for any CEO or for anyone in an organization, really, to identify the decision processes on which their organization hinges, on which the performance of the organization hinges, the ones that really make a difference. If you want to improve those processes, then, if you want to introduce debiasing and or a form of decision hygiene in those processes, my advice would be start small. Start small. Start with a few very simple techniques and apply them one by one. Don't try to take the whole recipe book and to do everything at the same time, because you will end up doing nothing. Start with a few things. Start, for instance, with the example I was giving you earlier. In meetings, ask people to write down what they think before you go around the table. That's a good way to combat groupthink. Or start with introducing the pre-mortem, the great invention of Gary Klein, which consists of forcing people to take a few minutes to imagine that you are in a future where your decision has failed, and asking them again to write down what they think about it, so that you can then have a conversation that tends to combat over-optimism and groupthink, or over-optimistic groupthink, as I should call it in those types of settings. That's a very practical technique that lots of organizations find helpful. But don't try to do these two things or even 20 different things at once. Try to do one, because at first, people are going to be a little bit skeptical. They're going to be a bit resistant. What are you telling me, boss? You want me to imagine that we failed? But no, boss, we're not going to fail because you're such a great leader. Right? If that's the dynamic that you've had, it's going to take a while for people to actually get to where you want them to be, which is to express their doubts, to express their nuances, their opinions, etc. And once you get them comfortable with one of those tools, you'll be able to add a second one and a third one and so on. And that's how you build a culture of disciplined decision making. It doesn't happen in one go. It's not one magic wand that you wave at your decision making processes. You actually build this gradually. And by building it gradually, you change the mindsets and you change the culture. People often tell me, oh, we couldn't do this in our organization because we have a culture that is not amenable to those kinds of things. And I get it. I totally understand that. But the way you change a culture is with those techniques, is with those tools, is with those practical practices. Because once people start to practice things as simple as writing down first or the pre-mortem, they start to speak their mind. You change the culture in a subtle way, and that tends to then diffuse in the rest of the organization and change the culture of the organization. So that's how I would suggest people do it, one tool at a time.
Great. Eric.
Thanks very much, Olivier. I was sure that it would be a wonderful conversation, and we are very grateful to you for this insight, for this closing conversation at the Human Advantage Conference. But before we go, we would love to get your perspective regarding a final point, which is leadership and how behavioral science could help leader and organization in general. What do you think the future looks like? Anything you are excited or hopeful about regarding this topic?
I'm excited about the potential of behavioral science in business, and my focus, as you know, is on business. It's not on the public sector or the nonprofit sector, although I sometimes work with them. But I'm excited about the potential in business. I'm also a little bit worried about the risks that the growing popularity of behavioral science creates, because more and more people have a little knowledge of behavioral science, and a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. It tends to lead people to oversimplify and to have hasty ideas and simple conclusions about behavioral science. And I fear that in some places, in some circles, we're going to see more and more people saying, "Oh, behavioral science," or nudges. Of course, nudge will be the buzzword. Yeah, we've been there, we've done that, it doesn't work, or we disagree with that, it's bad, it's wrong. I mean, you're familiar, of course, with all the nudge bashing that we see these days, especially in France, surprisingly, where there seems to be more nudge bashing and fewer nudges than anywhere else I can think of. So I worry that the simplified or simplistic version of behavioral science might actually become too popular, and that's why I think that conferences like this and events like the ones you organize have a big role to play in conveying the breadth, the complexity, the richness of what behavioral science is all about, the many different applications that it can have, and also that it's very important, and I think that's what you've been doing throughout this conference, to create a sense of realism, of transparency, of honesty about what behavioral science can and cannot do. It's not a magic wand. It doesn't solve every problem in the world. There are lots of things that it will not do. There are some things it will do. And I think we need to move to a stage where we don't need to trumpet behavioral science as something that is the solution to everything, which I don't think anyone serious ever does, but rather where we have a science-based, realistic, sensible appreciation for what it can do, and a healthy respect for the challenges that remain.
Great. Thanks again, Olivier. It has been a real pleasure and honor to have you to close out day 2 at the Human Advantage conference. So thanks again.
The pleasure is mine.